Hi everyone, my name is Katie Russell and I am presenting community service around the world for CCJ 400. So jumping right in, community service as an alternative sanction reduces recidivism, lowers prison populations, provides an alternative to incarceration, and leads to higher success for offender reintegration from incarceration. So the start of community service around the world, let alone as an alternative sanction, began with harsh sentencing guidelines. So there was a non-action by prosecution, uninformed juries, harsher sentencing guidelines for the sake of the argument, so on and so forth, leading to a invalid court counsel. So harsher sentencing guidelines led to the emergence of alternative sanctions, i.e. community service. It also brought about the concept of equal balance of punishment to crime severity, additional sentencing, and alternative sanctions. So harsher sentencing led to alternative sanctions, and Barkow basically said that the punishment had to be proportionate to the crime, meaning that they couldn't, stick someone in prison for a year for running a red light. It just wasn't possible according to the court counsel at the time. So they decided in the courts that, that sentencing an individual to incarceration of any kind in addition to probation has increased crime rates. This due in part to the fact that many of the offenders who are incarcerated have committed a first offense that is not considered to be a crime. So in short, that means that if you were a first-time offender and you were placed in custody of a jail or a prison for the very first time for running a red light per se, and you were in custody for, let's say, like 6 months to a year, it actually created harsher criminals and a higher recidivism rate. So additional sentencing. According to Fraze, the issue surrounding the indefinite sentence to incarceration is that of a lack of prosecution in these states. This stigma has been shown to cause courts to impose a harsher sentence of incarceration no matter the severity. Due to these sentencing guidelines, community service and other alternative sanctions came about to be offered in addition to a custodial sentence or split sentence where the offender may serve some time in custody, be released on probation, and be referred to an alternative sanction. So what that means is that the prosecution basically said that no matter what, you're a criminal and you are guilty of the crimes that you have committed, and they wouldn't look at any of the other circumstances of the crime. And so to make things easy, they would usually just give a guilty verdict on behalf of the offender, thus incarcerating them and creating the overcrowding of prisons and jails. So alternative sanctions and actions. So the Nordic countries that include Finland, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden began utilizing the practice of community service as an additional sanction around the 1980s because the Supreme Court basically looked at how the prosecution was, for lack of better terms, being lazy, just saying, oh, you're guilty because you're a criminal, and said, no, we have a not so harsh sentencing guideline here in the Nordic countries, so we're going to implement alternative sanctions in addition to an incarceration, whether they're still in custody or being released on good behavior, for example, so that way we can free up our prisons and breed a higher success rate for rehabilitation for these offenders. But in Canada, it has, caused surrounding countries such as Canada to cause a net widening of crime, meaning that basically this talk of an alternative sanction in addition to an incarceration spread to other states, but because of the harsher sentencing guidelines across the rest of the United States and in other surrounding countries such as Canada, it actually caused crime rates to go up. And Canada implements what is called a custody threshold because of this, and it looks at if custodial sentencing is optional, can be suspended, or when custodial sentencing is available. Therefore, alternative sanctions such as community service began to be implemented in the 2000s in cooperation with the custody threshold to provide a fair sentencing. And in Alabama, they basically followed suit, and community service as an alternative sanction is proven over time to reduce incarceration rates significantly. So then came about risk-based assessments and evidence-based practices to help point these offenders in the right direction of which kind of treatments they should be engaging in and whether or not alternative sanctions would be beneficial to their sentence. So a risk-based assessment basically took the offender's top 3 criminogenic needs as of recently and would take those into account and target those 3 top criminogenic needs in order to put the offender in the most beneficial rehabilitation program so that the success rate for reintegration into society for these offenders would go up and the prison overcrowding problem would go down. And it has proven to be fairly successful, and evidence-based practices go into these treatment programs and programs otherwise, such as alternative sanctions, creating kind of like a catered sort of programming, if you will, in order to rehabilitate these offenders to the best of their officers' abilities. So the other issue that goes into community service as an alternative sanction and alternative sanctions coming about as a result of harsher sentencing guidelines is that of non-payment. So basically, non-payment looks at how those of a lower socioeconomic status, who were also minority groups, would be essentially just incarcerated and would have to serve their entire sentence in custody, whereas those who are white and of a higher socioeconomic status were given the option to, if you will, pay for a clean record so that they could get out early, whether it be on good behavior or paying off the officers in some cases in prisons in order to fulfill their alternative sanction and to reintegrate into society. So this wasn't really working, and the uninformed juries played into effect with the poor prosecution as well as the non-payment between the lower socioeconomic statuses and the higher socioeconomic groups by saying that, they would just sentence, these uninformed juries would just sentence these offenders no matter what, along with the prosecution, to incarceration, no matter what the circumstances of their crime was. And the Supreme Court said, no, we're not doing that. We're gonna implement alternative sanctions, and that happened about in the early 2000s in order to combat harsher sentencing guidelines and to avoid higher recidivism due to that first-time offender experience, as well as to create a more successful reintegration into society. So the things that were being done as a result of the problem of non-payment of fines and fees, jurors, and prosecutions in accordance with alternative sanctions was that of the Matterhorn Project and the Community Service Acceptance Program. So the Matterhorn Project was developed, and it's a computer system that basically asks the offender a series of questions, and based on these questions determines the income of these offenders, and the judge takes that into account in order to create a fair sentencing trial to avoid those harsher sentencing guidelines and to allow for more opportunities such as alternative sanctions. The Community Service Acceptance Program basically allows the community to be involved directly with the sentencing of those who have committed crime against them in their community. By allowing the sentencing of these offenders to be left to the fated decision of their communities, the offender, jury, and judge all have created a fair way to sentence individuals who may not deserve incarceration because of a minor crime such as running a red light. So basically, in accordance with these jurors, they become more informed as well as the rest of the court counsel by the community and take that into account whenever they are looking at the sentencing for these offenders. So the big picture is that alternative sanctions are often not discussed when it comes to sentencing guidelines for the United States and in fact are an afterthought in most countries. The research conducted by the researchers proves that harsher sentencing guidelines and sentences lead to more crime and a high prison population. This, at face value, does not attempt to show the gravity of the problem incarceration brings to offenders in the States and other countries, but merely shows the gravity of the effects of an ineffective government system outdated beyond its years. This research brings to light how harsh sentencing guidelines coupled with the poor counsel of a courtroom have led to the implementation of community service as an alternative sanction, along with the addition of alternative sanctions as an idea to begin with. The implementation of community service as an alternative sanction has been proven across countries to reduce recidivism and to alleviate prison population pressures and staffing. It is important to understand the ways in which a less harsh alternative to incarceration can benefit communities everywhere, whether it be for the offender, counsel, community, and/or prison staff. This research proposal will be best presented to a law enforcement agency under evaluation, if applicable, to bring awareness to the judicial system as to how alternative sanctions can help to benefit the reintegration and rehabilitation of offenders and communities. And these are my references. Sorry, they're a little bit small. I can attach a copy of my references at their actual size. And that is community service around the world.